Hello and welcome back to Watching Brief for the week of the 11th of October 2021. I am joined as ever by the simply marvellous Mr. Andy Brockman. Good afternoon, Andy.
Good afternoon, Mark. And when you introduce me in those effusive terms, I always think next, what does he want?
I want your company, you marvellous person, you. And also, of course, with it being October, I want to have a wonderful build-up to Halloween. As you can probably tell, my office is well decked out. We have cobwebs and chains and hands and feet hanging around. Although I note that you're taking a more subdued approach to Halloween.
Well, House Brockman, with the exception of Winterval, we tend not to sort of write the calendar on the body of the house, really. So we tend to internalize. For example, this time of the year, we tend to internalize our inner Wiccan, and so we go for the I mean we go for the sort of rich but minimalist approach. So it's jack-o'-lantern and pumpkin soup on the 31st, and and maybe something Tex-Mex in celebration of the Day of the Dead on the 1st of November.
So sort of classic, understated simplicity. Really, it's
and food,
an
and
elegant
food.
an elegant approach. But anyway, whether you go quiet or you go big, regardless of how we celebrate this time of year, Andy and I are here to continue our ongoing watching brief to discuss, well, usually the archaeological news of the week. Although this week, as last week, we are waiting on some bits and bobs to fully form, and we didn't just want to find completely random news stories to simply present to you. And so we figured that we would begin this week, having not quite managed to record last week, with a bit of a reflection. We figured it was a good idea to talk a little bit about why it is we do watching brief, and therefore I suppose what we believe about archaeological news and the interaction with journalism and the broader context of archaeology that we find ourselves discussing an awful lot in this series.
We've been doing this for over 320 episodes now. I think this is episode 327.
Yep.
If I remember correctly.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. And so we've covered a lot of very different ground in all those stories that we have covered. And
different and yet. And yet,
we've mentioned the Hobby Lobby a lot. Yeah.
And yet we began though with the Stonehenge bypass in January 2017. I mean, some stories are just evergreen, aren't they? Over the course of watching brief.
Absolutely, and which is why I think it's good to take a punctuation mark like this and look back on what we've done, and then look forward to maybe where we're going, and if we're going on in the same way, or if we're maybe looking to develop the form a little bit. I mean, the Stonehenge bypass is it is one of those stories. It's the gift that keeps on giving. It's a bit like Groundhog Day. That Grant Shapps is Punxsutawney Phil. He emerges from his lair, looks around, blinks in the sunlight, does something unlawful, and has to retreat again, and the whole project shelved for a bit. It's important to take stock, I think, and look back and look forward. So we should really be doing this at New Year, actually, shouldn't we? It's the old Janus thing.
Possibly, but the thing is, I felt it was an opportunity because it also lays some of the groundwork for some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about in the coming months as well.
True.
It's going to be, without saying what we're talking about in the coming months, it's going to be, I think, important for people to be able to understand where we're coming from, archaeologically and journalistically. Archaeolistically, is that a new portmanteau? And I suppose for me, my interest in archaeology and the news really reached its first milestone in 2013. I had been reporting on news weekly, actually, with something called Archaeoscoop, a series that I used to do on Archaeosoup, where I would just sort of pick a couple of headlines a week and essentially point to them. But in February 2013, I became particularly interested with the way in which the archaeological discovery of Richard III was being reported, and the relationship between the journalists surrounding a TV production that surrounded an archaeological dig in Leicester, ran by the archaeological department at Leicester University. And how it looked as though they came dangerously close to really losing control of their own work. Now, in that instance, it was complex because it was also partly, I believe, partly funded. The endeavour was partly funded by people who wanted to present the story in a slightly more dramatic way, namely, for example, Channel 4 on the TV series. But it just struck me as an interesting case study, and it sort of got me thinking about these questions of the power relationship between archaeologists, journalists, for the most part traditional journalism, and also the public. And another example that kind of came out not long, I think not long after that, was at Binchester, the Durham University annual excavation that they used to do. I think they now dig at Bishop Auckland Castle, but they were digging at a Roman fort called Binchester, where a sculpture was uncovered. It was a Romano-British stone sculpture head that had a very distinctive hairstyle, and so it was a very Roman hairstyle, very Iron Age looking eyes in terms of artistic style. And despite the archaeologists sort of sending off the facts and ideas to the press office seemed to sort of want to, sexy up the story a little bit, and it ended up being reported in the Sun as having been, well, if you're British, then you'll know the name Gaza. If you're not British, being reported as a retired, slightly infamous footballer, and his visage having been discovered in a trench at a Roman fort. And again, it was just that question of the stuff of archaeology almost slipping through our fingers when it comes to how it's where the coal face is of people actually understanding the work that's ongoing in the field. But I first really became aware of your interest in this space where edutainment, I guess, or sort of entertainment meets archaeology in the context of your fascination with the Odyssey company.
That's probably fair to say. I mean, yeah, around the time, in fact, around the time you were starting and building up Archaeosoup as a brand, I was getting involved in a couple of things, including, first of all, campaigning on particular issues, and one of which was the discovery by Odyssey Marine Exploration of HMS Victory, which sank in 1744 in the English Channel, and the arguments around treasure hunting and maritime archaeology. And also there were other issues around at the time. For example, I started looking at illegal metal detecting and the illicit recovery of particularly militaria from sites in the UK and in France and Belgium and now and elsewhere. And so I pretty soon worked out that, for me at least, if I was going to make a contribution anywhere, it wasn't going to be campaigning, because other people were doing that and were better at that, and there are difficulties around that, which we'll no doubt come back to in other watching briefs in future. But what I could do was what I think very few people were doing up to that time, which was treating archaeology as news and current affairs. They were treating it as archaeology, as heritage, but they weren't dealing with the up to the minute issues, like, for example, what's our relationship with government, what's our relationship with government funding, what's our relationship with the media, as you were pointing out.
I suppose also, I guess, a tendency to almost see archaeological reporting as a succession of additions to a national curio cabinet. Oh, we found one of these. We've got one of those. Exactly. The oldest this. Yeah. The youngest that, or whatever.
That's exactly right. And then again, in that period, 2012, 2013, 2014, and it's when we first started doing recordings together, I think. But I was the lead archaeologist on the Burma Spitfires project, where we were absolutely in the eye of the media, very deliberately so. It was a high-profile project, but that involved working very closely with a TV documentary crew and the head of PR for Wargaming, who were the sponsors of the project. and making sure that what we were doing as archaeologists, first of all, was conveyed appropriately, and then wasn't misrepresented, and then actually insisting that we were involved in the decision-making processes on how what we were doing was presented, and the fact that we were going to write a public report that was going to be made freely available, and so on.
So you've got that notion of accessibility and accountability, I suppose, which often archaeologists, I've certainly observed, don't particularly understand why they should be accountable for certain things in their lives.
Yeah.
But also,
we can come back to that later.
Yeah. Well, I think specifically, actually, also, one of the ways in which that really was highlighted for me when observing you. Was when I started, I looked a little bit at the TV series, for example, surrounding the Odyssey company. And what you had there were people who were archaeologists, absolutely archaeologists. They even had it was on the screen and everything, so-and-so, archaeologist, who were doing their best to justify what was often often a process that was always in the process of being justified. That is to say that the company frequently found itself in court. The archaeological discoveries that were featured on the TV show weren't often much to do with the reason why they were actually investigating the wreck. We found some spoons, wonderful, but I wonder if there's some gold bullion here, this kind of thing. Or some sherry or something that might be recoverable in bottles. I think it was one of the shows. And so really out of that came, for me, also in talking with you as well, a growing awareness that as you often say, archaeologists aren't always the good guys.
And not just in Indiana Jones.
No, well, no, exactly. Yeah, you don't have to be Belloc. Yeah, if only you spoke of Ethos, Indy. Yeah,
yeah.
But and that is to say that and I'm not specifically pointing at your man in Odyssey and saying he was a bad guy, but rather that we all can bring, and we all, I think, by definition, must bring our own individual personal reasons, agendas, beliefs, socio-political goals, familial goals to the practice of archaeology, and that inevitably, business goals as well, inevitably will shape the narrative as you want it to be told, and therefore the conversation that can unfold around it. I suppose, as you put in the notes here, archaeology is not monolithic, and the conversation that unfolds as soon as you start looking at archaeological news in a slightly not so much critical way, but sort of editorial way, I think highlights that, and that's one of the reasons why we've been interested in doing Watching Brief for this long, isn't it?
Absolutely. Look, I see what I do, and by extension, I see Watching Brief really as being a critical friend. But both of us, we're involved in archaeology because we love it, because we think it's important, because we think it reaches the parts that other disciplines don't reach. But when I say archaeology isn't monolithic, I say that because there's a tendency in parts of certainly the UK archaeological world at the moment, and I think it grows from a kind of defensiveness, a lack of confidence in the sector as a whole, that any kind of criticism of archaeology, of archaeologists, of particular stances is somehow dividing the profession. And I think you only have to look at, you mentioned earlier Stonehenge being our very first story, the Stonehenge bypass being our very first story.
Yeah, it'll be our last story as well. I'm sure it'll be the final the final thing we talk about. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Just as we run out of internet, we'll be talking about
which could be sooner rather than later, given what's been happening to the social media apps in the last few days. But anyway, we'll come back to that later. No, I mean, the Stonehenge bypass, the A303 upgrade, has been polarizing in the archaeological world, and it's been polarizing ever since it was first really presented as a possibility in the 1990s, as a serious possibility in modern times in the 1990s. So to pretend that it's not divisive, I think, is naive, and to refuse to address uh, arguments that are made pro and contra because it might be seen as divisive, I think is dangerous.
Hmm.
I don't think I think you can't suppress legitimate arguments unless you know.
Well, and
Um,
yet at the same time, I think it's worthwhile. If you don't mind, I'll just play a little bit of devil's advocate here. At the
oh
same
no,
time,
please no. That's important too. Like I
yeah.
said, critical friends.
Well, and at the same time, I suppose what I would say is that for a long time, in fact, I know I have certainly, have been pushing
Mm,
for more of a united voice in archaeology, more
mm,
cross the aisle conversation within the sector, so that people
mm,
outside the sector can understand better what the archaeological perspective is. Is your problem here seemingly one of taking a stance on ideological grounds as opposed to on sound, for example, in this instance, legal grounds when it came to Stonehenge?
Look, I think it was a very bad look that professional archaeologists, and particularly archaeological companies and archaeological organizations, took a stance in favour of the current UK Highways plan for Stonehenge
Hmm.
before all the legal moves were worked out, because people were warning that this was not just controversial, but parts of the project, the way it was framed, were potentially illegal.
Hmm. Hmm.
And they still went with it. And in fact, even after the High Court found on two grounds that the Transport Secretary had acted unlawfully on two grounds in granting the project the go ahead, they were still, instead of welcoming the fact that the law was being upheld, they regretted the decision.
Yes. Hmm.
Now, I think that for the morality of archaeology, that's dangerous ground to be stepping on, because it's almost like saying that if we as archaeologists say this is okay, it doesn't matter what the law says.
Hmm.
And I
Hmm.
don't think we should be in that area. I think it's important that those arguments are aired,
Hmm.
and however inconvenient they are, however much certain vested interests, for example, and it could be argued, for example, that historic England require because it's dependent entirely on the government for its funding, and Wessex Archaeology is a commercial organisation that stood to make millions of pounds out of work on the Stonehenge upgrade, the A303 upgrade. That it could be argued colours their inputs to the process.
Hmm.
And I think it is incumbent on us as commentators, as journalists, as observers, if we see that, to call it out and invite and offer the information, and then people can make up their own minds.
Okay. Now, it's also in that context of being a critical friend, it's also been important, and it's been in that sense an honour to be able to help other people within the sector tell their stories. So
Mm,
recently, obviously, we've had interviews with people involved with the proposed and eventual closure of departments. So we're talking about, for example, Sheffield and Worcester universities. And that sort of stuff isn't necessarily as exciting as comparing something to Stonehenge. As old as Stonehenge, or as big as two Waleses, for example. But it is something that I think also ties in with this uh, this reason for us doing this. In so much as you just mentioned the soul of archaeology, and I
mm,
think that sort of gets to the heart of it. But I think we're both interested in the quality of archaeology's soul, as opposed to observing individuals necessarily, and hoping that, or expecting those people to be beyond reproach. Rather, it's
mm.
it's about having conversations that help us all to better understand how we can all be better archaeologists. Um, and I don't know. I mean, what is there anything else that comes out of that for you in terms of um, helping people to talk about things that maybe their bosses wouldn't necessarily want them to be talking about, perhaps, but in doing so, helping that soul of archaeology?
One of the things I've been most moved by and most encouraged by in the last year or so is even in some quite appalling circumstances that and we've explored at Worcester and at Sheffield. People have been prepared to trust us, to talk to us, to trust us that we will tell the story fairly, and to investigate what is actually going on, and again to put information out there in the public domain. But in both cases, in Worcester and at Sheffield, we've seen university senior management teams trying to, in PR terms, control the narrative. And because people have been prepared to talk to us, because sources on many stories, people are prepared to share with us information, their thoughts, documents, text, emails, often very, at risk to themselves, and we can't name them, but it's really, really important that we're able to operate in that kind of area so that we can, tell the stories that maybe other people would find inconvenient for us to tell. There's the old adage in journalism that the news is something somebody doesn't want you to print. Everything else is advertising. And I think particularly these last few months when we've been looking at those stories, that has been very large, and I'm very pleased that we've been able to do that, and I hope we'll be able to continue to do that.
So in that sense, archaeologists aren't always the good guys, but also archaeologists are often in need of a signal boost as well. And beyond that, archaeologists, I hope through our conversations, are shown to be a whole variety of different types of people. There are management, there is the underdog, there is the good-hearted, and there is the cynical within the world of archaeology. And I think that's, for me, that's the most important thing, and that has been to present not only an interest in what's happening and what's been found and where it's been found, but also in talking about the quality of the people who do archaeology.
What I think it is worth remembering is that archaeologists are a community in and of themselves, and a very diverse one, as you've just alluded to. The good, the bad, the average, the wonderful. The inspired and the apparatchik. But beyond that, I think we have to remember that we are also part of a community, or a community of communities. We're part of a wider world. I mean, and the obvious example at the moment is issues around climate change, where what we can offer in terms, as a community of archaeologists, in terms of knowledge, of historical perspective on the impact of climate on society and so on, ties in absolutely, for example, with our involvement in the development sector. And where archaeologists, I think, need to come up with a stance on, for example, whether to push for retrofit first, because it's now clearly acknowledged by many authorities that demolition and rebuilding is the most carbon unfriendly way of development, means of development. I've just been looking at a case in Northampton where the former Debenhams store is to be demolished and rebuilt, and student flats are going to be with retail on the ground floors are going to be built on that site, whereas an equivalent Debenhams building in Oxford Street is going to be retrofitted for retail and accommodation. So, which is arguably a much more environmentally friendly option, and shows that it can be done. Do archaeologists take a stance on those things? Should companies state that they don't wish to work on projects that aren't zero carbon?
I mean, but as you say, it's one of those things where it's not an easy answer, but it's certainly
there is no easy answer. No,
no,
exactly.
And I suppose also as well that there are ongoing questions and case studies as to specifically where it is archaeologists interact with the public, and
Mm,
how open we are to meeting people on site, for example, how open we are
mm,
to discussing ongoing research with the public, and how
mm,
welcoming we are with those things. I mean, at the moment, uh, this has been a fascinating summer to observe, because there's an awful lot of archaeologists getting back out into the field, being able to work in something
mm.
closer to a normal work situation as we approach uh, the latter third, I guess, hopefully, of the pandemic. Um, but also, in that sense, seeing lots of, that interest in archaeology come flooding back as well has been wonderful to see. And so it's, again, without, while being abstract, it's been interesting, and I continue to be interested in observing uh,
Mm,
how archaeologists claim to want to interact with the public, and how we actually do as a sector. Because all of
mm,
this has a bearing on how we're viewed as a profession, whether or not we are in fact viewed as professionals, in fact, to be honest.
mm,
And also, and therefore, it has a bearing on public policy making. It has a bearing on work and pay conditions, and our ability collectively to claim that sort of ethical, moral, authoritative stance on history and archaeology. And I'm not saying that at the expense of pluralism, but rather I am saying, for a reason. Archaeologists, um, and their ability and our ability to talk about the past, is something that we shouldn't take for granted, that people need to listen to us. Yeah, it's those are the, okay. So those are the reasons why we're interested in doing Watching Brief, and why we continue doing it. And I thought it was worthwhile exploring that this week. And hopefully, in the coming weeks and months, when stories come up surrounding all of these different questions that we've been talking about today, we'll be able to point to this little discussion, but also hopefully you'll bear this discussion in mind as us being um, interested, friendly observers. We are. What did you say? The a critical friend of archaeology, in
mm.
that sense. Um, and yeah, and in that sense, absolutely wanting to see a future for this study of the past. With that in mind, we once again have a slightly shameless, but in fact entirely, I think, necessary. Actually, I'm going to stop calling it shameless. Reference to and plug for our Patreon offering. We currently only have one segment on the Archaeosoup Patreon, which is for a generalised support of Watching Brief, as little as $1 per month. But we will be in the coming weeks also announcing a series of extra tiers for that support. We have some merch ideas. We have some levels of interaction that we're currently cooking up, and we'll look forward to announcing that as and when we can. But do check it out. Link will be below. If you believe in what we've been doing for the past 5 years, over the past 327 episodes, for the past, was it 4.5 days worth of 24-hour viewing pleasure, as you put here on the notes. Um, yeah, 4.5 days straight. If you wanted to watch it, you could. Then please do consider supporting us on Patreon. I suppose finally, I mean, is there any way that you would close up this little reflection on the this, I suppose, the extended study and conversation that we've been having about archaeology, and how we are interacting with the wider world?
I'd only say that I think it's more important than ever that people engage not just with the surface of archaeology, but with what lies behind it.
Hmm.
And if, when you lift up the stone, you find something wonderful and fascinating, yeah, report that, talk about that, share that. But if, when you lift up the stone, you find something that's sort of uglier, slimier, more questionable, then I think we have to be brave enough and honest enough with ourselves to interact with that as well.
Hmm.
And what I would say really is, uh, the pipeline, which I edit, and Watching Brief here, we rely on people to help us tell stories. And if you've got information that you think the public need to share, then please share it with us, so that we can help you tell the story and tell the story safely.
Yeah.
Because there are people who prefer some stories that aren't told, and I think they need to be called out.
So it's certainly something that we've seen again this summer, isn't it? Definitely.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I suppose in that sense, I would just remind people that Andy's DMs are always open on Twitter. I think mine are as well, but you can definitely email us as well at the email that's below on screen.
Yeah.
I suppose I would just add to that by just saying ultimately what we're looking for here, and one of the notes that I've made here actually is that we want to continue to expand the conversation to gain tips and insights into those things which aren't just advertising, but are the things that people don't necessarily want us to talk about, as you say. But also to become a safe space, a safe place, a welcoming place for conversations about the state of the heritage sector. Professional, commercial, and academic interests are enveloped in that.
Yeah.
And a place where I mean, to be honest, like even earlier this week, I had an interesting conversation with someone via YouTube comments, where a gentleman was suggesting that the British Museum is illegally selling artifacts, and you and I had a bit of a back and forth. There was a slight titter of really, but actually we took it at face value. I've said, okay, wow, if there's evidence of that, let us know. We'll take a look at it. I don't think the evidence will be forthcoming. But regardless, approachability is one of the things that we try to foster here as well, along with everything else. And we look forward to continuing that process, that conversation with you. That's this week, I guess. That's this watching brief. Next week, there hopefully will be something that's currently coalescing. Will be available for you. And we've got a couple of one or two interviews lined up as well in the near future. Well, the medium distance future. Again, it's all in a cloud coming together. But I guess finally, just thank you guys for watching. Thank you for your ongoing comments and conversations and interactions online. And also, frankly, if I'm honest, just for keeping us sane. I mean, the very fact that it's possible to find people who share at times our exasperation, but also at times our passion for these stories has been genuinely lovely. And from time to time, it's very valuable, actually, I think, to look back on that and look back on the past 5 years and see where we've come from and where we're going. I suppose. Shall we also invite people to, if they have any particular suggestions, if there's anything in particular that they want to see in terms of the shape of this weekly format as we do proceed. Please do, again, feel free to comment below or get in touch. We're still experimenting, and so. You can be part of helping us improve. Maybe even become less annoying. Less dad jokes.
Yeah, look, yeah, exactly. I just finish up by
No,
saying
no,
that,
there'll always be dad jokes. I'm sorry, that's just
no, but I just finish up by saying that I think one of the reasons why I got into archaeology late as a mature student. I worked in theatre and performing arts before that, and so storytelling is something that is absolutely second nature to me. And archaeology has some wonderful stories, some of the most wonderful stories to tell. And in the end, that's what we're in. That's why we do what we do. I think it's because storytelling is at its most basic. It's something that is it's one of the things that makes us human. Sharing stories, whether it was around the campfire or as here on on an electronic, on a digital social media platform. It's one of the best things that we can do as a species.
Yeah. Well, there we go. Thank you for your time this week, as ever, Andy. Thank you guys for watching at home. Please do comment below. Please do consider supporting us on Patreon. And please do add to that conversation because, yeah, it's an ongoing one. Until next time, guys, do take care. Bye-bye.